The bolt shell that ended everything began its journey in the sacred forges of Mars 3 centuries before Gregor Eisenhorn was born, crafted by tech adepts whose devotion to the Omnissiah bordered on the fanatical. Blessed by 100 liturgies and inscribed with micro-prayers in 17 dead languages, it waited in darkness for the moment when it would serve the Emperor's will. That moment came when Inquisitor Hapshant of the Ordo Hereticus pressed it into the chamber of his bolt pistol, aimed at the skull of his own student, and pulled the trigger. But that is the end of our story. The beginning starts elsewhere, in the smoking ruins of Hubris, where a young man named Gregor Eisenhorn first learned that the universe was far stranger and more terrible than any human mind could safely comprehend. The planet Hubris had been dying for 3 days when the Inquisition arrived, not the clean death of orbital bombardment or the quick mercy of virus bombs, but the slow, creeping corruption that came when reality itself began to unravel at the edges. The air tasted of copper and madness. Gravity fluctuated without warning, sending debris floating upward before crashing down with bone-breaking force. And in the distance, always in the distance, something that might once have been music played melodies that hurt to hear. Gregor Eisenhorn was 23 years old and had been an interrogator for exactly 4 months when he followed his master, Inquisitor Hapshant, through the twisted streets of Hubris Prime. He carried a las pistol that had never been fired in anger, and a book of imperial prayers that he recited under his breath whenever the world seemed to shift around him. His faith was pure, his loyalty absolute, and his understanding of what it meant to serve the Emperor's Inquisition almost completely theoretical. "Tell me what you see, Gregor," Hapshant said, as they picked their way through the ruins of what had once been a market square. The older man moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to distrust his own senses, his augment eyes scanning constantly for threats that conventional vision might miss. Eisenhorn looked around at the devastation, trying to apply the lessons he had learned during his training on Terra. Buildings twisted into impossible geometries, streets that led in directions that violated basic principles of navigation, people, or things that had once been people, moving with purpose through the chaos, their faces bearing expressions of terrible contentment. "Chaos, corruption," he answered, proud of his ability to identify the threat. "Probably Tsinch, given the reality distortions and the architectural anomalies. We should call for orbital support and have this entire district sterilized." Hapshant stopped walking and turned to study his student with eyes that had seen the deaths of worlds. "Should we?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of experience that Eisenhorn could not yet comprehend. "And what of the civilians who might still be salvageable? What of the imperial infrastructure that could be preserved? What of the knowledge we might gain about how this corruption began and how it might be prevented on other worlds?" The questions hung in the air between them like accusations. Eisenhorn felt his certainty crumble, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that the simple answers he had been taught might not be adequate for the complex realities of inquisitorial work. The Codex Hereticus states that when facing major chaos incursions, immediate purification is the preferred response, he said, falling back on the doctrine that had shaped his education. The Codex Hereticus was written by men who never set foot on a corrupted world, Hapshant replied, who never had to choose between absolute purity and practical necessity. "Come, let me show you what it truly means to serve the Emperor's will." They continued deeper into the corrupted district, past sites that Eisenhorn's training had not prepared him for, a fountain that flowed upward, its waters defying gravity as they spiraled into patterns that hurt to look at directly. Children playing games with dice that had too many sides, their laughter creating harmonics that made nearby windows crack, a bakery where the proprietor still sold bread to customers who paid with coins that bore the faces of emperors who had never existed. "The corruption here is relatively mild," Hapshant explained as they walked. "A minor daemon incursion, nothing more. The kind of thing that happens when someone dabbles in forbidden knowledge without understanding the consequences. The standard response would be exactly what you suggested. Orbital bombardment, followed by exterminatus if necessary. Clean, simple, effective. They reached their destination. A modest chapel dedicated to the Emperor, its walls still bearing the scorched marks where someone had tried to burn away graffiti written in languages that predated human speech. Inside, a small group of civilians huddled around an altar where a statue of the Emperor stood with arms outstretched in blessing. The statue's face had been altered, its features twisted into an expression of alien malevolence, but the people praying before it seemed unaware of the change. "Watch," Hapshant whispered, producing a small device from his coat. It looked like nothing more than a brass sphere covered in intricate engravings. But when he activated it, the air around them began to shimmer. The altered features of the Emperor's statue wavered like a mirage, revealing the original blessed visage beneath. The effect spread outward from the device, reality reasserting itself as the chaos corruption was pushed back. The twisted graffiti faded from the walls. The harmonics that had filled the air with discord resolved into the proper hymns of imperial worship. The people at the altar blinked in confusion, their memories of the past 3 days becoming hazy and indistinct. "A null field generator," Hapshant explained, deactivating the device and returning the small sphere to his coat. "Heretical technology, by most definitions. It functions by creating areas of psychic dead space that prevent warp entities from maintaining their influence on reality. The Mechanicus would have me burned for possessing such a thing. The Ordo Malleus would declare me a radical and have me shot. But it just saved the lives of 37 imperial citizens and restored a consecrated chapel to proper function." Eisenhorn stared at his master with a mixture of awe and growing unease. The device Hapshant had used violated several fundamental principles of imperial doctrine. Possession of xenotech was forbidden. Traffic with alien technology was heresy, yet the results were undeniably positive. Corruption purged, lives saved, the Emperor's light restored to a place where darkness had taken hold. "I don't understand," he said finally. "If such devices exist, why aren't they standard issue for inquisitorial forces? Why hide their existence from other imperial institutions?" Hapshant's smile was sad, tinged with the weight of secrets that had cost him sleep for decades. "Because the Imperium is not wise, Gregor. It is powerful, it is vast, it is often necessary, but it is not wise. Wisdom requires the ability to see beyond simple categories of pure and impure, loyal and heretical. Wisdom requires the strength to make choices that others will condemn, even when those choices serve the greater good." They left the chapel and began the long walk back to their transport, passing through streets that were slowly returning to normal as the null field's effects continued to spread. Eisenhorn found himself wrestling with questions that his education had taught him not to ask. If heretical technology could serve righteous purposes, what did that say about the nature of heresy itself? If the Imperium's own institutions would condemn actions that saved imperial lives, what did that say about the wisdom of unquestioning obedience? "Master," he said as they reached the edge of the corrupted district, "are we heretics?" Hapshant stopped walking and turned to face his student directly. For a long moment he said nothing, his augment eyes focusing on Eisenhorn's face with mechanical precision. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession that had been years in the making. "Yes," he said simply. "By the strict definitions of imperial doctrine, we are. I have studied forbidden texts, used xenotech, and made alliances with entities that the ecclesiarchy would consider abominations. I have broken laws, violated oaths, and committed acts that would see me burned at the stake if they were discovered by the wrong people." The admission hung between them like a physical thing, heavy with implications that Eisenhorn was only beginning to understand. "But," Hapshant continued, I have also saved worlds. I have prevented demon incursions that would have consumed entire systems. I have preserved knowledge that has proven crucial to humanity's survival. I have made the hard choices that lesser men refuse to make. And I have accepted the burden of being condemned for doing what was necessary. They walked in silence for several minutes, Eisenhorn's mind reeling as everything he thought he knew about his calling was systematically dismantled. The Inquisition he had dreamed of serving was supposed to be pure, righteous, uncompromising in its devotion to imperial doctrine. But the reality was far more complex, filled with moral gray areas and choices that had no clean answers. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. "Because you have the potential to become something more than just another mindless zealot with a rosette and a bolt pistol," Hapshunt replied. "Because the Imperium needs inquisitors who can think beyond the boundaries of doctrine when doctrine proves inadequate. Because the enemies we face are too clever and too adaptable to be defeated by simple adherence to rules written by men who died centuries before we were born." They reached their transport, a nondescript ground car that had been modified with armor plating and concealed weapons systems, and began the journey back to the starport where their ship waited. As they drove through the recovering city, Eisenhorn watched ordinary Imperial citizens going about their daily lives, unaware of how close they had come to damnation and how narrowly they had been saved by methods that their own government would consider heretical. "There will come a time," Hapshunt said as they navigated the crowded streets, "when you will have to choose between blind obedience and practical necessity. When you will have to decide whether to follow orders that you know will lead to unnecessary death and suffering, or to break those orders in service of a higher purpose. When that time comes, remember what you have seen here today. Remember that the Emperor's will is not always the same as imperial law." The words would prove prophetic, though Eisenhorn could not know it at the time. He was still young enough to believe that such choices could be avoided, that there would always be a path that satisfied both conscience and duty. He had not yet learned that the universe was crueler than that it delighted in presenting good men with impossible decisions and watching them break under the weight of necessity. Their ship, the Eisenhorn, was a converted merchant vessel that had been extensively modified for inquisitorial service. From the outside, it looked like countless other traders that plied the shipping lanes between imperial worlds. Inside, it housed laboratories, interrogation chambers, armories and libraries that contained knowledge gathered from across the galaxy. It was Hapshunt's mobile base of operations, his sanctuary, and his prison rolled into one. The voyage to their next assignment took 2 weeks through the warp. 2 weeks during which Eisenhorn found himself questioning everything he had been taught about his calling. He spent hours in the ship's library, reading reports of previous inquisitorial operations and beginning to understand the full scope of what it meant to serve the Emperor's Inquisition. Some of the reports were straightforward accounts of heroic inquisitors rooting out corruption and destroying threats to imperial security, but others told darker stories of compromise and moral ambiguity, of inquisitors who had been forced to work with criminals, xenotech, and even demon-possessed individuals in order to prevent greater catastrophes. The more he read, the more he began to understand that his master was not unique in his willingness to bend the rules when circumstances demanded it. The Inquisition was full of men and women who had learned that absolute purity was a luxury that the servants of the Emperor could rarely afford. They called them radicals, and they were opposed by Puritans who insisted that no compromise with the enemy could ever be justified. The tension between these two factions had shaped the Inquisition for millennia, and it would shape Eisenhorn's own career in ways that he was only beginning to comprehend. Their destination was the hive world of Gudrun, where reports of cult activity had reached the attention of inquisitorial authorities. The planet was a major industrial center, its population numbering in the tens of billions. its factories producing everything from last guns to starship components for the Imperial war machine. If chaos cults had indeed taken root in such a vital world, the consequences could affect the entire sector's ability to wage war against the Emperor's enemies. Gudrun was Eisenhorn's first real taste of inquisitorial investigation. Unlike the straightforward demon incursion on hubris, this was a problem that required subtlety, patience, and the careful application of investigative techniques that his training had covered only in theory. They established a cover identity. Hapshant posed as a wealthy merchant looking to invest in Gudrunite industries, while Eisenhorn played the role of his assistant, and began the slow process of infiltrating the social circles where cult activity was most likely to flourish. The work was frustrating and often tedious. Days passed without meaningful progress as they attended social gatherings, cultivated contacts among the planetary elite, and tried to identify patterns of behavior that might indicate chaos influence. Eisenhorn found himself longing for the straightforward certainties of combat, where enemies could be identified and eliminated without the need for weeks of careful investigation. "Patience, Gregor," Hapshant counseled as they returned to their hotel after another fruitless evening of social interaction. "The enemies we seek are not the crude cultists who paint 8-pointed stars on alley walls and perform blood sacrifices in abandoned buildings. These are sophisticated operators who have learned to hide their corruption behind masks of respectability and social standing. They must be exposed carefully, methodically, without giving them the chance to disappear into the general population." The breakthrough came, as such things often do, through accident rather than design. Eisenhorn was returning from a routine meeting with a potential informant when he noticed that he was being followed. The pursuit was professional, conducted by individuals who clearly had training in surveillance techniques. Rather than confront his followers directly, he led them on a circuitous route through Gudrun's commercial district, using the opportunity to observe their methods and try to determine who had sent them. The chase ended in a maintenance tunnel beneath one of the city's primary manufactorums, where Eisenhorn found himself facing 3 individuals whose appearance immediately marked them as something other than ordinary citizens. Their clothing was expensive but somehow wrong, cut according to fashions that had never been popular on any imperial world. Their faces bore subtle modifications that enhanced their natural features beyond normal human parameters. Most disturbing of all, their eyes held an intelligence that seemed both ancient and utterly alien. "Gregor Eisenhorn," one of them said, his voice carrying harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. "The young interrogator who thinks he understands the true nature of heresy. How little you know of the forces that shape the galaxy around you." The confrontation that followed was Eisenhorn's introduction to the kind of enemies that the Inquisition faced when dealing with truly sophisticated chaos operations. These were not mad cultists driven to extremes by supernatural influence, but calculating individuals who had made conscious choices to ally themselves with the powers of the warp in exchange for knowledge, power, and longevity that normal humans could never achieve. They fought with weapons that violated several laws of physics, firing energy beams that curved through space according to principles that had nothing to do with gravity or magnetism. They moved with inhuman grace and coordination, their enhanced reflexes allowing them to anticipate and counter Eisenhorn's attacks before he had fully committed to making them. And they spoke of plans and conspiracies that stretched across centuries, of events that had been set in motion before Eisenhorn was born and would continue long after his death. The battle was brief but decisive. Eisenhorn's training and equipment gave him advantages that even chaos-enhanced reflexes could not overcome. His last pistol, blessed by the Mechanicus and loaded with sanctified power cells, punched through their enhanced physiology with reliable efficiency. His flak armor, inscribed with protective wards, turned aside energy attacks that should have reduced him to ash. Most importantly, His faith in the Emperor provided a barrier against the psychological warfare that his enemies attempted to employ against him. When the shooting stopped, 2 of his attackers were dead, and the 3rd was dying from wounds that no amount of chaos enhancement could heal. But the dying cultist's final words would haunt Eisenhorn for decades to come. "You think you serve the Emperor?" the man whispered through lips that were already turning blue with oxygen deprivation. "But the Emperor is dead, young Inquisitor. Has been dead for 10,000 years. What sits on the golden throne is something else entirely. Something that feeds on human worship and grows stronger with every prayer offered in its name. When you finally learn the truth, when you see what your precious Imperium really is, remember that we offered you a chance to choose a different path." The words were clearly meant as a final act of psychological warfare, a desperate attempt to plant seeds of doubt that might bloom into corruption in the years to come. Eisenhorn recognized the tactic from his training and dismissed it as the raving of a dying heretic, but the words lodged themselves in his memory nonetheless, joining the growing collection of uncomfortable questions that his service to the Inquisition had already begun to accumulate. The investigation that followed the tunnel confrontation led to the exposure of a chaos cult that had infiltrated the highest levels of Gudrunite society. The conspiracy reached into the planetary government, the Imperial Guard command structure, and even the local ecclesiarchy hierarchy. Rooting it out required months of careful work, during which Eisenhorn learned the difficult art of conducting investigations in environments where any misstep could result in the destruction of evidence or the escape of crucial suspects. The final purge was conducted with military precision. Hapshant called in favors from across the sector, assembling a strike force that included elements from 3 different Space Marine chapters, 2 regiments of Imperial Guard, and a collection of inquisitorial agents whose specialties ranged from psychic interrogation to xenobiological analysis. The operation was planned down to the minute, with simultaneous raids on dozens of targets across the planet's surface. Eisenhorn's role in the operation was to lead a strike team against the cult's primary ritual site, a converted warehouse in Gudrun's industrial district, where the cultists had been conducting ceremonies designed to weaken the barriers between reality and the warp. The site was heavily defended, both by conventional security measures and by supernatural protections that had been put in place by chaos sorcerers. The assault began at local midnight, when psychic interference from the planet's dual moons would be at its minimum. Eisenhorn's team consisted of 6 stormtroopers from the Gudrunite PDF, 2 combat servitors on loan from the local Mechanicus enclave, and a Space Marine librarian from the Firehawks chapter who had volunteered his services for the operation. The warehouse's conventional defenses fell quickly to concentrated Lascannon fire and crack grenades, but the supernatural protections proved more challenging. The building's interior had been modified according to principles that owed nothing to Imperial architecture, its rooms connected by passages that led in directions that ordinary geometry could not accommodate. Demon things lurked in the shadows, their forms shifting and changing according to rules that human perception could not fully grasp. And at the center of it all, in a chamber that existed in too many dimensions for normal space to contain, the cult's leadership had gathered to perform a ritual that would have torn a permanent hole in reality itself. The battle for the ritual chamber was Eisenhorn's introduction to warfare on a scale that conventional military training could not prepare him for. The enemies they faced were not limited by physical laws or human limitations. They struck from impossible angles, wielded weapons that fired ammunition made from crystallized screaming, and spoke words of power that could kill by being heard. But the Imperial forces had advantages of their own. The stormtroopers fought with the disciplined precision that came from generations of training in the Emperor's service. The combat servitors provided firepower and resilience that could match anything the cultists could deploy. And the Space Marine librarian wielded psychic powers that had been sanctified by the Emperor himself, turning the cultists' own weapons against them. The ritual was stopped just moments before its completion, the cult's leadership killed or captured before they could finish the incantations that would have doomed Gudrun to the same fate that had befallen Hubris. But the victory came at a cost that Eisenhorn had not anticipated. 3 of the stormtroopers were dead, their minds burned out by psychic attacks that no amount of armor could deflect. One of the combat servitors had been possessed by a demon and had to be destroyed by its partner before it could turn on the Imperial forces. And the Space Marine librarian had been wounded in ways that conventional medicine could not heal, his psychic abilities permanently damaged by his exposure to the ritual chamber's corrupted energies. The aftermath of the operation was Eisenhorn's first real taste of the bureaucratic nightmare that followed every major inquisitorial investigation. Reports had to be filed with dozens of different Imperial agencies. Evidence had to be catalogued and analyzed. Witnesses had to be interrogated and their testimony evaluated for signs of chaos corruption. The dead had to be examined for evidence of mutation or possession. And through it all, the normal business of governing and defending an Imperial world had to continue without interruption. It was during this period that Eisenhorn first encountered the Ordo Xenos, in the person of Inquisitor Ravenor, who had been assigned to evaluate certain artifacts that had been recovered from the cult's ritual site. Ravenor was young for an Inquisitor, only a few years older than Eisenhorn himself, but he possessed a depth of knowledge about alien technology that was both impressive and slightly disturbing. "These are not chaos artifacts," Ravenor explained as he examined a collection of crystalline devices that the cultists had been using to focus psychic energy. "The craftsmanship is clearly xenotech, probably Eldar in origin, though modified according to principles that I don't recognize. The question is how a chaos cult on a backwater hive world managed to acquire technology from one of the galaxy's most secretive alien races. The discovery added a new dimension to the investigation, one that required expertise in areas where Hapshant's knowledge was limited. The cooperation between the Ordo Hereticus and the Ordo Xenos was sometimes difficult. The 2 orders had different priorities and different methods, but the complexity of the case demanded a collaborative approach. Eisenhorn found himself working closely with Ravenor over the following weeks, learning about alien technology and the ways in which xenotech could be adapted for human use. It was his first exposure to the philosophical questions that surrounded humanity's relationship with other intelligent species. The Imperium's official position was clear. All aliens were enemies of mankind and had to be destroyed or enslaved. But the reality was more complex, as Eisenhorn learned when Ravenor showed him examples of alien technology that had been integrated into Imperial systems without most users being aware of their origins. The Imperium contains more xenotech than most Imperial citizens would be comfortable knowing about, Ravenor explained, as they examined a power source that had clearly been manufactured by non-human hands. "The machine spirits that guide our starships include components based on Eldar psychic circuitry. The targeting systems in our weapons incorporate principles derived from Tau ballistic computers. Even the Golden Throne itself is built around alien technology that the Emperor acquired during the Dark Age of technology." The revelation was disturbing, not because it challenged Eisenhorn's loyalty to the Imperium, but because it highlighted the gap between Imperial doctrine and Imperial practice. The same institution that preached human purity and alien extermination was itself dependent on xenotech for its basic functioning. "Does this make us hypocrites?" Eisenhorn asked during one of their late-night research sessions. Ravenor considered the question seriously before answering. "No," he said finally. "It makes us pragmatists. The universe is vast and hostile, filled with threats that humanity cannot face with pure doctrine alone. We use whatever tools we must to survive, and we try not to let moral philosophy interfere with practical necessity." The sentiment echoed what Hapshant had told him on Hubris, and Eisenhorn began to understand that this attitude was not unique to his master. but was shared by many within the Inquisition. The willingness to bend rules and compromise principles when circumstances demanded. It seemed to be a common trait among inquisitors who had survived long enough to gain real experience in their calling. The investigation of the cult's alien connections led them to a rogue trader named Tobias Maxilla, whose commercial operations had provided a cover for smuggling xenotech into Imperial space. Maxilla was a complex figure, part legitimate businessman, part criminal, part explorer whose expeditions into uncharted space had yielded discoveries that advanced human knowledge while violating numerous Imperial laws. The confrontation with Maxilla took place on his flagship, a converted battlecruiser that had been modified with technology from a dozen different alien races. The ship was a marvel of hybrid engineering, its systems combining Imperial, Eldar, Tau, and even Orc components in ways that should have been impossible, but somehow worked with remarkable efficiency. Maxilla himself was equally hybrid, his body enhanced with cybernetic implants that incorporated technology from across the galaxy. His left eye had been replaced with an Eldar psychic sensor that could perceive events across multiple dimensions. His right arm was a mechanical prosthetic that incorporated Tau servo technology for enhanced precision and strength. Even his brain had been augmented with neural interfaces that allowed him to directly control his ship's alien systems. Inquisitor Hapshant, Maxilla greeted them with the easy charm of a man who had talked his way out of countless difficult situations. And young Eisenhorn, I've been expecting you. Tea, I have an excellent blend from the Tau world of Dalith. The local herbs have psychoactive properties that are quite enlightening. The offer was politely declined, but Eisenhorn found himself fascinated by the casual way in which Maxilla discussed his violations of Imperial law. The rogue trader seemed genuinely puzzled by the idea that his activities might be considered heretical. I serve the Emperor's interests, Maxilla explained when Hapshant outlined the charges against him. Every piece of xenotech that I acquire is studied and catalogued. The knowledge we gain is shared with appropriate Imperial institutions. The tactical advantages we develop are used to protect human worlds from alien threats. How is this different from what the Inquisition itself does when it studies chaos artifacts or demon weapons? The question was uncomfortably perceptive, highlighting parallels between Maxilla's activities and the Inquisition's own willingness to use forbidden technology when circumstances demanded it. The difference, Hapshant explained, was one of authority and oversight. The Inquisition was sanctioned by the Emperor himself to investigate and use dangerous knowledge in the service of humanity's survival. Rogue traders had no such authority, but the distinction felt increasingly arbitrary to Eisenhorn as he listened to the debate between his master and the xenotech smuggler. Both were breaking Imperial laws in pursuit of knowledge that they believed would serve the greater good. Both were using alien technology to enhance their capabilities and protect human interests. The only real difference was the presence or absence of official sanction, a bureaucratic detail that seemed less important than the practical results of their actions. The resolution of the Maxilla case set a pattern that would define much of Eisenhorn's later career. Rather than arrest the rogue trader and confiscate his technology, Hapshant negotiated an agreement that would bring Maxilla's operations under unofficial inquisitorial oversight. The rogue trader would continue his explorations and technology acquisition, but he would share his discoveries with the Inquisition and submit to regular inspections to ensure that his activities remained within acceptable bounds. It was Eisenhorn's first direct exposure to the network of informal alliances and mutually beneficial arrangements that allowed the Inquisition to extend its reach far beyond what its official resources would permit. Rogue traders, criminal organizations, alien collaborators, and even demon-possessed individuals could all serve Imperial interests under the right circumstances. Their questionable loyalties balanced by their unique capabilities and access to resources that conventional Imperial institutions could not provide. The lesson was reinforced during their next major investigation, which took them to the death world of Cinchare, where an archaeological expedition had uncovered ruins that predated human settlement by millions of years. The expedition's leader, a tech adept named Magos Vali, had discovered technology that defied all known scientific principles, devices that could manipulate time, alter gravity, and interface directly with human consciousness in ways that the Mechanicus had never achieved. But the technology came with a price. The archaeological team had begun experiencing psychological changes within days of beginning their excavation. Their personalities shifted, their memories altered, their fundamental understanding of reality warped by exposure to alien science that human minds were not equipped to comprehend. Some members of the team had disappeared entirely, leaving behind only empty clothing and faint energy traces that suggested they had been translated to dimensions that conventional physics could not describe. The investigation of Cinchare was Eisenhorn's introduction to the concept of dangerous knowledge, information that could not be safely possessed by human minds without fundamental alteration of human nature. The alien ruins contained libraries of scientific data that could advance human civilization by millennia. But accessing that knowledge required surrendering essential elements of humanity itself. Magos Vali had made that choice, allowing the alien technology to modify his consciousness in exchange for understanding that no unaltered human could achieve. When Eisenhorn and Hapshant found him, he was no longer recognizably human, his organic components replaced by crystalline matrices that pulsed with energies that hurt to look at directly. He spoke in mathematical formulae rather than words, his thoughts operating according to logical principles that had never evolved on any world where biological life was possible. "The knowledge is beautiful," Vali explained through synthesized vocalizations that bypassed normal speech entirely. Patterns within patterns, equations that describe the fundamental architecture of reality itself. But it requires minds capable of processing infinite complexity, consciousness unbound by the limitations of biological neural networks. Humanity as it exists cannot contain this understanding. Humanity as it could become would find such understanding natural and necessary. The choice facing the investigation team was clear but uncomfortable. They could preserve the alien knowledge by allowing it to transform them as it had transformed Vali, gaining scientific understanding that would benefit all humanity at the cost of their own human nature. Or they could destroy the ruins and preserve their humanity while sacrificing knowledge that might be crucial to humanity's long-term survival. Hapshant chose a third option. He negotiated with Vali to establish a controlled interface between the alien technology and human researchers, a system that would allow limited access to the alien knowledge without complete transformation of human consciousness. The compromise satisfied no one completely. Vali considered it an inefficient waste of the technology's potential, while Eisenhorn worried that any exposure to the alien influence might eventually lead to the same corruption that had claimed the archaeological team. But the solution worked. After a fashion, a research station was established on Cinchare, staffed by volunteers who accepted the risks of limited exposure to alien knowledge in exchange for scientific insights that advanced Imperial technology by centuries. The researchers retained their essential humanity, though all of them were changed by their work in ways that made normal social interaction difficult. The Cinchare investigation taught Eisenhorn that the universe contained knowledge that was genuinely dangerous, not because it was evil or corrupting in the traditional sense, but because it was simply too vast and complex for human minds to safely contain. The experience shaped his understanding of why the Imperium maintained such strict controls on scientific research and xenological investigation. Some knowledge was worth any price to obtain, but other knowledge carried costs that no amount of benefit could justify. The years that followed were filled with similar cases, each one teaching Eisenhorn new lessons about the complexity of the choices that inquisitors faced in their service to humanity. He learned to work with criminals and outcasts when their unique skills made them valuable allies. He studied forbidden texts that contained tactical information about chaos forces, accepting the psychological risks in exchange for knowledge that helped him protect Imperial worlds from demon incursions. He even began using minor xenotech devices when they proved more effective than Imperial equivalents, though he was careful to submit to regular purification rituals to minimize the spiritual contamination that such use might cause. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Eisenhorn found himself changing. The rigid moral certainties of his youth gave way to a more pragmatic understanding of right and wrong. He learned to evaluate actions based on their results rather than their conformity to Imperial doctrine. He developed the ability to work with individuals whose loyalties were questionable, building alliances based on mutual benefit rather than shared ideology. Most importantly, he learned to make decisions that others would condemn, accepting the burden of moral isolation that came with serving a cause larger than any individual conscience. The change was gradual enough that Eisenhorn did not recognize it as it was happening. He saw himself as the same loyal Imperial servant who had followed Hapshunt through the ruins of hubris, dedicated to protecting humanity from the threats that surrounded it on all sides. The methods he used might have evolved, but his fundamental loyalty remained unchanged. It was only when he looked back from the perspective of years that he could see how far he had traveled from his original position. The transformation became undeniable during the Pontius Glor affair, a case that began with the routine investigation of a suspected chaos cult and escalated into a confrontation with forces that threatened the stability of an entire sector. Pontius Glor had been a heretic of the worst sort, a chaos sorcerer whose experiments with demon summoning had resulted in the corruption of 3 Imperial worlds before his eventual capture and execution. But death had not ended Glor's threat to Imperial security. The sorcerer had found a way to cheat death itself, transferring his consciousness into a crystalline prison that preserved his knowledge and personality while allowing him to influence events in the physical world. The investigation that led to the discovery of Glor's continued existence took Eisenhorn into the darkest corners of Imperial society. He worked with smugglers who trafficked in forbidden knowledge, consulted with rogue psychers whose abilities were technically heretical, and even entered into negotiations with minor demons who possessed information that could not be obtained through conventional means. Each compromise brought him closer to the truth about Glor's plans, but also further from the moral certainties that had once defined his sense of identity. The climax of the Glor investigation took place on the agri-world of Hubris, the same world where Eisenhorn had first learned about the complexity of moral choice under Hapshunt's guidance. But Hubris had changed since their last visit, its population reduced to a fraction of its former size by a plague that had swept through the agricultural districts. The planet's remaining inhabitants lived in constant fear of the creatures that had emerged from the plague zones. Mutated humans whose exposure to chaos influence had transformed them into something that was no longer recognizably human. Glor's influence had been subtle but devastating. The sorcerer had corrupted the planet's water supply with psychoactive compounds that made the population more susceptible to chaos influence. He had manipulated agricultural production to create famine conditions that drove desperate people to turn to forbidden practices for survival. Most insidiously, he had established a network of human agents who were completely unaware of their true loyalties. Their minds programmed with subliminal commands that activated only when specific conditions were met. The final confrontation with Glor took place in the ruins of the same chapel where Hapshunt had once demonstrated the use of heretical technology to purge chaos corruption. But this time, the corruption was too deep and too widespread to be removed by conventional means. The sorcerer's consciousness, housed in its crystalline prison, had become integrated with the planet's psychic ecosystem, to such a degree that destroying it would require the destruction of every living thing on Hubris. Eisenhorn faced a choice that would define the rest of his career. He could follow imperial doctrine and order the exterminatus of Hubris, ensuring that Glor's influence was completely eliminated at the cost of 10 million innocent lives. Or he could attempt to contain the threat using methods that violated every principle of imperial orthodoxy, preserving the planet's population at the risk of allowing chaos corruption to spread to other worlds. He chose the latter option, entering into a psychic duel with Glor's imprisoned consciousness, while using forbidden techniques learned from his years of investigating chaos cults. The battle was fought on multiple levels of reality simultaneously, as Eisenhorn struggled to contain a mind that had been enhanced by centuries of demon worship and chaos mutation. The conflict raged through dimensions that human perception could not normally access, with each combatant drawing on powers that challenged the fundamental laws of physics. The victory, when it came, was achieved through means that Eisenhorn could never have imagined when he first began his service to the Inquisition. He defeated Glor by absorbing the sorcerer's consciousness into his own mind, using psychic techniques that were considered the darkest form of heresy by imperial doctrine. The process left him fundamentally changed, his personality enriched with knowledge and memories that belonged to one of the Imperium's greatest enemies. But the technique worked. Glor's influence over Hubris was broken, the planet's population saved from corruption and death. The crystalline prison that had housed the sorcerer's consciousness was destroyed, ensuring that his knowledge could never again be used to threaten imperial worlds. The victory was complete, achieved through methods that no Puritan Inquisitor would ever have considered, but that proved effective when orthodox approaches had failed. The aftermath of the Glor affair marked Eisenhorn's final transformation from Puritan to radical. The knowledge he had absorbed from the Chaos Sorcerer's mind gave him insights into the nature of the warp and the tactics of chaos forces that no amount of conventional study could have provided. But it also marked him as potentially corrupted in the eyes of his Puritan colleagues, creating tensions within the Inquisition that would shape the rest of his career. Hapshant, who had been monitoring the investigation from his position as Eisenhorn's superior, understood the significance of what had happened. During their final conversation before Eisenhorn was granted full Inquisitor status and independence of action, the older man spoke with the weight of someone who had made similar choices and understood their consequences. "You have crossed a line that many of our colleagues consider unforgivable," Hapshant said, as they stood in the observation deck of the Asane, watching Hubris slowly rotate beneath them. "You have used the enemy's own methods against them, contaminated yourself with knowledge that the Puritans consider irredeemably corrupting. There will be those who say that you are no longer fit to serve the Emperor's cause." Eisenhorn nodded, understanding the truth of his master's words. He could feel the presence of Glor's memories within his own mind, foreign thoughts and alien knowledge that would forever mark him as different from normal imperial servants. The change was irreversible, a fundamental alteration of his nature that would influence every decision he made for the rest of his life. "But," Hapshant continued, "you have also proven that sometimes the orthodox methods are insufficient to meet the threats we face. You have shown that it is possible to use the enemy's weapons against them without being corrupted by them. That knowledge, that example, may prove invaluable to future generations of Inquisitors who find themselves facing similar choices." The conversation marked the end of Eisenhorn's apprenticeship and the beginning of his independent career as an Inquisitor. He was granted command of his own ship, the Asane passing to his control as Hapshant retired to a teaching position on Terra. The vessel came with a crew that included many of the individuals who had served Hapshant for decades, men and women who understood the complexities of radical inquisitorial operations and could be trusted to support their new master regardless of the methods he chose to employ. Eisenhorn's first independent investigation took him to the mining world of Gudrun, where reports of alien artifacts had reached the attention of inquisitorial authorities. The investigation proved to be more complex than initially anticipated, involving a conspiracy that reached from the lowest levels of the mining crews to the highest echelons of the planetary government. The case required all of the skills that Eisenhorn had developed during his apprenticeship: the ability to work with questionable allies, the willingness to use forbidden knowledge when orthodox methods proved inadequate, and the courage to make decisions that others would condemn. The success of the Gudrun operation established Eisenhorn's reputation as an effective radical inquisitor, someone who could be trusted to get results regardless of the complexity of the challenges he faced. Over the following decades, he would handle dozens of similar cases, each one adding to his knowledge and experience while further distancing him from the orthodox inquisitors who maintained strict adherence to imperial doctrine. The network of allies that Eisenhorn assembled during these years reflected his radical approach to inquisitorial work. His inner circle included individuals whose backgrounds would have made them targets for investigation by Puritan inquisitors. Elizabeth Beckwin, a human blank whose psychic null field made her invaluable for operations against psychers and demons. Godwin Fischig, a former member of the Adeptus Arbites whose experience with criminal investigations complemented Eisenhorn's own skills. Harlan Nail, a bounty hunter whose knowledge of the criminal underworld provided access to resources that official imperial institutions could not offer. Perhaps most controversially, Eisenhorn also began working with alien individuals when their unique capabilities made them valuable allies. His relationship with the Eldar Farseer Eldrad Ulthran began as a mutual exchange of information about chaos threats that menaced both human and Eldar worlds. Over time, it evolved into a genuine alliance based on shared goals and mutual respect, despite the fact that such cooperation violated fundamental imperial doctrine about humanity's relationship with alien species. The practical benefits of these alliances were undeniable. Eisenhorn's investigations consistently produced results that protected imperial worlds from threats that might otherwise have caused massive casualties. His methods, while unorthodox, proved effective at containing chaos incursions, preventing alien invasions, and rooting out conspiracies that threatened imperial security. The success of his operations earned him recognition from the highest levels of the Inquisition, including personal commendations from Lord Inquisitors who might have been expected to disapprove of his radical methods. But success came with a price that became increasingly apparent as the years passed. Each case required Eisenhorn to make choices that further separated him from orthodox imperial doctrine. Each alliance with questionable individuals created new vulnerabilities that his enemies within the Inquisition could exploit. Most seriously, each exposure to forbidden knowledge and chaos influence left its mark on his psyche, gradually eroding the mental barriers that protected him from corruption. The cumulative effect of these changes became evident during the Cherubale incident, a case that began with the investigation of a demon incursion on the civilized world of Farnes. The demon in question was a creature of unusual intelligence and power, capable of possession and manipulation on a scale that conventional exorcism techniques could not address. Worse, it had gained access to information about imperial defenses and strategic plans that it was using to coordinate attacks by chaos forces throughout the sector. Eisenhorn's initial attempts to banish the daemon using orthodox methods proved completely ineffective. The creature was too powerful and too well informed to be defeated by conventional exorcism rituals. Desperate to prevent further chaos victories, Eisenhorn made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He bound the demon into a controlled servitude, using techniques learned from his absorption of Pontius Glor's memories to create a prison that contained the creature while allowing him to access its knowledge and abilities. The bound demon, which Eisenhorn named Cherubale, became one of his most powerful assets and his greatest vulnerability. The creature's knowledge of chaos tactics and warp phenomena proved invaluable in subsequent investigations. Its supernatural abilities allowed Eisenhorn to confront threats that no normal human could have faced. But the relationship also created a constant temptation, as Cherubael continuously offered greater power and knowledge in exchange for increased freedom and influence. The presence of the bound demon in Eisenhorn's retinue marked him as irredeemably radical in the eyes of many within the Inquisition. Puritan inquisitors who had previously been willing to overlook his unorthodox methods now considered him a serious threat to imperial security. The tension between the different factions within the Inquisition began to focus on Eisenhorn himself, as he became a symbol of the philosophical conflicts that divided the organization. The crisis came to a head during the investigation of the Ophidian Cabal, a conspiracy that involved corrupt members of the Inquisition itself. The Cabal had been using their official positions to traffic in forbidden knowledge and chaos artifacts, selling imperial intelligence to the highest bidders regardless of their loyalties. The conspiracy reached into the highest levels of several Ordo organizations, including individuals who had the authority to order Eisenhorn's investigation and execution. The conflict that erupted from this investigation pitted Eisenhorn against members of his own organization, forcing him to choose between loyalty to the institution that had shaped his entire adult life and loyalty to the principles that he believed the Inquisition was meant to serve. The choice was particularly painful because many of his opponents were genuinely committed to serving the Emperor's will, their Puritan convictions leading them to conclude that Eisenhorn's radical methods posed a greater threat to imperial security than the corruption they were meant to combat. The final confrontation took place on the space station Dura, where Eisenhorn had arranged to meet with representatives of the Ophidian Cabal in an attempt to gather evidence of their treachery. But the meeting was a trap, orchestrated by Puritan inquisitors who intended to eliminate Eisenhorn and his entire retinue as dangers to imperial orthodoxy. The battle that followed was fought between imperial servants on both sides, each faction convinced that they were defending humanity against its enemies. Eisenhorn survived the encounter, but at a cost that left him fundamentally changed once again. Several members of his retinue were killed in the fighting, including individuals who had served with him for decades. His relationship with the institutional Inquisition was irrevocably damaged, marking him as a rogue agent whose loyalty to imperial doctrine could no longer be trusted. Most seriously, his use of Cherubael's powers during the battle had required him to grant the demon additional freedom, weakening the bindings that kept it under control. The aftermath of the Dura incident marked the beginning of Eisenhorn's final transformation from radical inquisitor to outright renegade. Cut off from official imperial support, he was forced to rely increasingly on his network of criminal and alien allies to continue his investigations. His methods became ever more extreme as conventional options were closed off to him, leading him to experiment with techniques and technologies that even other radical inquisitors would have considered beyond the pale. The process was gradual, but inexorable. Each investigation required greater compromises with forces that orthodox imperial doctrine considered irredeemably corrupt. Each victory was achieved through methods that further separated him from the organization he had once served with complete loyalty. The knowledge he had accumulated over decades of investigating chaos threats began to warp his understanding of reality itself, as he gained insights into the nature of the warp that no human mind was meant to possess. The final stage of Eisenhorn's transformation was triggered by the Pentagram Crisis, an investigation that revealed a conspiracy spanning multiple sectors and involving threats that challenged the fundamental assumptions of imperial science. The enemy he faced was not chaos in any conventional sense, but something older and more alien, a force that had been manipulating human civilization since before the founding of the Imperium. The investigation led Eisenhorn into forbidden areas of knowledge that even his radical philosophy had never contemplated. He found himself studying alien technologies that violated the basic laws of physics, consulting with entities whose existence challenged human understanding of life and consciousness, and using methods that required him to sacrifice essential elements of his own humanity in exchange for the power necessary to combat threats that conventional imperial forces could not even recognize. The climax of the Pentagram investigation required Eisenhorn to make a choice that completed his transformation from loyal imperial servant to something else entirely. To defeat the alien conspiracy, he was forced to allow Cherubale complete freedom in exchange for the demon's full cooperation in the final battle. The decision saved hundreds of imperial worlds from a fate worse than destruction, but it also meant that Eisenhorn could no longer maintain any pretense of orthodoxy or loyalty to imperial doctrine. The bound demon, freed from the constraints that had limited its actions for decades, revealed the true extent of its power and knowledge. Cherubale was not merely a chaos entity, but a fragment of something far more ancient and terrible, a piece of the universe that had existed before the current cosmic order and remembered truths that no mortal mind was equipped to comprehend. The knowledge it shared with Eisenhorn in exchange for its freedom fundamentally altered his understanding of reality, the Emperor, and humanity's place in the cosmic order. Armed with this terrible knowledge, Eisenhorn finally understood the true nature of the choice he had been making throughout his career. The path from Puritan to radical to renegade had not been a series of random moral compromises, but a deliberate progression designed to prepare him for a role that transcended ordinary human understanding. The enemies he had been fighting were not separate threats to be defeated individually, but aspects of a cosmic conflict that had been raging since before the birth of the galaxy itself. The Emperor, Eisenhorn learned, was not the divine figure that imperial doctrine portrayed, but something far more complex and terrible. The entity that sat on the golden throne was indeed dying, as the heretics had claimed, but its death was not an end, but a transformation into something that would reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself. The Imperium was not humanity's salvation, but a vast ritual designed to focus human psychic energy toward the creation of a new cosmic order that would replace the current universe entirely. This knowledge brought with it a responsibility that no human should have been asked to bear. Eisenhorn found himself positioned as a guardian of secrets that could destroy human civilization if they were revealed, but which were necessary for humanity's ultimate survival in a universe where normal physical laws were breaking down. He became something beyond human understanding, a being who existed in the spaces between loyalty and treachery, between order and chaos, between salvation and damnation. The transformation was completed when Hapshant, now serving as a Puritan Lord Inquisitor, arrived to investigate reports of Eisenhorn's collaboration with forbidden forces. The confrontation between master and student was inevitable, representing the fundamental philosophical divide that had always existed within the Inquisition, but which had now become impossible to bridge. Hapshant came to the meeting prepared for battle, armed with weapons blessed by the Emperor himself and accompanied by a retinue of the most loyal and orthodox inquisitors available. He believed, with perfect sincerity, that Eisenhorn had been corrupted beyond redemption, and that the man he had once trained was now a threat to everything the Imperium represented. The evidence supported his conclusion. Eisenhorn was openly working with demons, aliens, and heretical technologies in pursuit of goals that no orthodox imperial servant could approve. But the reality was more complex than Hapshant could understand. Eisenhorn had indeed been changed by his exposure to forbidden knowledge, but the change had been necessary to prepare him for responsibilities that transcended the normal categories of loyalty and heresy. The cosmic forces he was working to contain posed threats to reality itself, dangers that could only be confronted by someone who had voluntarily surrendered their own humanity in service to a higher purpose. The final confrontation took place in the ruins of the same chapel on Hubris, where both men had first learned about the complexity of moral choice in the service of the Emperor's will. But the roles were now reversed. Hapshant represented orthodox doctrine and the safety of conventional understanding, while Eisenhorn had become something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human morality. The battle was brief, but decisive. Eisenhorn had capabilities that his former master could not match, powers derived from his alliance with Cherubale and his study of forces that orthodox inquisitors refused to acknowledge. But he took no pleasure in the victory, understanding that he was destroying not an enemy, but a man who had shaped everything he had become. As Hapshant lay dying, his body destroyed by weapons that violated several laws of physics, he looked up at his former student with eyes that still held the clarity of absolute faith. "I understand now," he whispered through lips that were already growing cold. "You haven't been corrupted, Gregor. You've been prepared. But for what? What purpose could justify becoming whatever you are now?" Eisenhorn knelt beside his dying master, his face bearing an expression of profound sadness for the necessary sacrifice that had just been completed. "To save the Emperor," he replied, his voice carrying harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. "To preserve humanity through the transformation that is coming. To be the guardian of secrets that will determine whether our species survives the birth of the new cosmos." Hapshant's final words were lost in the sound of bolt shells being chambered, as the backup forces he had brought began their assault on the chapel. But his eyes, in the moment before death claimed him, held an expression that might have been understanding, or forgiveness, or simply the peace that comes with the completion of duty. The assault was repelled, but Eisenhorn knew that it was only the beginning. The Inquisition would send other agents, better armed and more knowledgeable about his capabilities. The hunt would continue until either he was destroyed or the cosmic transformation he was working to facilitate reached completion. He had become exactly what Hapshant had once warned him about. A man who had sacrificed everything, including his own humanity, in service to a vision of necessity that others could not share. But as he stood in the ruins of the chapel, surrounded by the bodies of men who had died believing they were serving the Emperor's will, Eisenhorn felt no regret for the choices he had made. The path from Puritan to radical to renegade had been necessary, each step preparing him for the responsibilities he now carried. The knowledge he possessed, terrible as it was essential for humanity's survival in a universe where the old certainties were crumbling and new cosmic orders were being born. In the end, Gregor Eisenhorn had become exactly what the universe required him to be, neither fully human nor completely alien, neither loyal servant nor dangerous heretic, but something that existed in the spaces between all such categories. He was the Emperor's most faithful servant and his greatest enemy, the guardian of humanity's future, and the destroyer of everything it had believed about itself. The bolt shell that would eventually end his story was still waiting in the sacred forges of Mars, crafted by tech adepts who had no knowledge of the role it would play in the cosmic drama that was unfolding around them. But when that time came, when the final choice had to be made between salvation and damnation, Eisenhorn would be ready to accept whatever sacrifice the Emperor's will demanded of him. Until then, he would continue his work in the shadows, protecting a species that could never know the price of its survival, serving an emperor whose true nature would destroy the faith of those who worshipped him. He had become the greatest and most terrible of the Inquisition's agents, a being who embodied every contradiction and moral paradox that defined humanity's struggle for survival in the grim darkness of the far future.